Hello class, this week we will be looking at the plant tribe Cynodonteae. So the group we're examining, Cynodonteae, has a panicle of spicate unilateral branches. So spicate just essentially means it has a spike-like inflorescence, but it's panicled. So the spike-like inflorescence has these little small panicles or these kind of little short branches coming off that main rachiis. And then those spikelets tend to occur on one side of that branch, which is what makes it unilateral. Oftentimes, there's crowded groupings of spikelets on relatively short branches, and oftentimes they look like eyelashes. The spikelets, again, are unilateral, so again, that means they tend to occur on one side of that branch. And typically, whole unilateral branches fall off as a unit of dispersion. So right above me in this photo, you can see those kind of spicate unilateral branches that are panicled off of the main inflorescence. And those spicate unilateral branches essentially all fall off on that kind of grouped basis as a unit of dispersion. And typically when we're some important species we're going to be thinking about in Cynodonteae are going to be the grama grasses, especially blue and black grama. So first off, we have side oats grama, or Butella curtipendula, and that's because it's pendulant, as we'll soon see. And so in terms of its stats, it's a perennial native species. And then in terms of its inflorescence, it's panicled because it has these little pedicels that come off that main spicate or spike-like branch. And typically these kind of spicate branches are unilateral, so the panicles are all on one side or coming off the pedicels are all kind of positioned on one side of the branch as it's unilateral. The branches are often distant from each other, and they're often what we call pendant. And so pendant essentially just means it's kind of hanging off loosely from these branches instead of standing erect or upright like you might expect with a lot of other plants we've seen. And they kind of turn off to the side. After disarticulation, essentially disarticulation is when it drops its seeds. And so after disarticulation, the branch base, so the pedicel essentially remains, as well as the glumes that pedicel or branch base holds, whereas the rest of the spikelets and florets within being housed by that branch and glumes essentially fall off at disarticulation as dispersal mechanism. In terms of its spikelets, it's typically crowded, and typically there are 3 to 7 spikelets per branch. And usually there are also sterile florets, and these sterile florets usually have 3 awns that are kind of short. And then the perfect florets, which typically occur below the sterile florets, also have 3 awned lemmas that are also 3-toothed. And so that's how you might distinct those sterile and perfect flowers. Also, sterile flowers don't have all the floral parts, whereas perfect florets would have all of those kind of flower parts we've discussed in previous lectures, like anthers and stigmas and ovaries, etc. In terms of its vegetative characteristics, it's typically a cescitose species and is also rhizominous. The rhizomes themselves aren't like typical rhizomes, and oftentimes they can become a little scaly, kind of like how stolons might become. But this plant can also produce stolons, even if rarely. The blades themselves typically grow basally out of the cespitose bunch, and the leaf margins often have scattered hairs. So that's like literally the margin, the edge of the leaf has hairs coming up out of it, which is a different defining characteristic than having hairs just coming out of the main surface, adaxial or abaxial surface of the leaf. This is specifically referring to the margins, which is that edge. And if you think of like a edge of a paper. And then typically the culms that it produces are erect and typically have smooth purplish nodes. In terms of side oats grammas or Butella curtipendula, and its growth characteristics. It's a warm season plant. And again, this is different than many of the other plants we reviewed, which typically were cool season plants. And it has a lot of, this warm season plant has a lot of early spring growth, which is sometimes unusual for a warm season plant. It typically flowers in July through September, and then it can reproduce well from seeds or from tillers or through that rhizome production. As mentioned, it also can rarely or sometimes produce stolons and reproduce that way as well. In terms of forage, it makes really great livestock and wildlife forage in the summer and the fall, and it actually remains moderately palatable throughout the winter, which also makes it important forage. It also makes great hay. In terms of habitat, it typically occurs on dry plains and prairies and rocky hills, and is really abundant in fine texture soils. And so that again is soils that are high in clay and maybe some silt, and seldom do they occur in very coarse soils like sandy soils. They're often better adapted to calcareous and moderately alkaline soils, better than neutral or acidic soils. So alkaline soils are the opposite of acidic soils. They have a higher base, or they're basic, so to speak, and they have a higher pH. And calcareous soils are also more alkaline, but they specifically have more calcium or calcium carbonates in them. So next up we have black grama, or Butella areopoda. In terms of its stats, it's also a perennial native species. In terms of its inflorescence, it's also panicled, and it's also spicate with primarily unilateral branches. The branches, though, are typically ascending, and so they go upwards, and they're often slender and delicate, and they have this kind of white lanate, which is kind of this woolly growth, which we'll see on the next slide. Spikelets typically are 8 to 20 in 2 different rows on the branches, and typically are not very crowded like we saw like we'll see with some other species. It has one rudimentary floret above with a lemma that is 3-awned, but could be reduced, and so that means the awns could be smaller or shorter. It also has one perfect floret below, and there the lemma is usually bearded at the base or hairy at the base, and it also has a lemma with 3 awns, so unfortunately the awn count doesn't help you there. But like I mentioned previously, perfect florets will have all the flower parts that we previously talked about, whereas rudimentary florets will be missing some of those flowering parts. And apologies for the misordering of the caption, but that's a vegetative characteristic. And so the blades mostly grow basal, and again, that means they're growing up out of the cespitous bunch, and they're often flat below and twisted as they kind of grow upwards and at the tips of the leaves. Oftentimes, these plants can be stoloniferous, and they can often produce short rhizomes and be rhizomatous as well, or rhizomatous as well. The culms themselves, sorry for the typo, are often wiry, and they often spread and are slender. And so that means they kind of grow outwards from each other, and they're pretty slender and thin. The internodes are often arched, so those are like those little nodes, those little bumps kind of going up in between the grasses, and oftentimes they're kind of more definedly arched. And the lower internodes are often woolly pubescent. And so we've had this term before. Pubescent means soft type of hairiness, and woolly is really a dense type of hairiness. And it appears as alternating between glabrous and pubescent areas. And so again, glabrous, a review of that term, is a smooth, hairless surface. And so these internodes at the bottom, lower internodes, essentially alternate between glabrous and pubescent. And the sheaths themselves are often glabrous, which again means no hairs. And so here are the rudimentary florets that we are talking, or sorry, rudimentary and perfect florets that we're talking about. And so the rudimentary florets are typically above, and they kind of have these 3 awns, and these kind of awns may be reduced. And so here we can see a circled example. There are some more, And so you can see this is essentially, sorry, let me get a pointer. This is essentially above this kind of like lower base of the floret or the actual palea and lemma area. And then we have one perfect floret below at the lemma base, which has a lemma also with 3 awns. And again, that is the floret right there that is in that blue bracket. And on this slide, you can kind of see that woolly linnate I was talking about on the culms or the inflorescent culms right here. So in terms of its growth characteristics, black grama or Botella areophyta is a warm season plant and it grows in the late spring when there's sufficient moisture. Otherwise, it might grow a little bit later in the summer. And it reproduces mainly through stolons and tillers and can sometimes be rhizomatous. It has really low seed productivity and viability. And so oftentimes it produces more asexually compared to in the kind of the traditional sexual reproduction sense. It typically grows in frequent pure stands, likely because it's spreading asexually from the stolons. And it is not grazing tolerant, which is something important for you to remember. In terms of its forage quality, it's typically excellent for all livestock classes throughout the year, as well as wildlife. And oftentimes it can produce adequate hay when there's enough moisture in that season. In terms of habitat, it often occurs in rocky or sand mesas, on dry hills and dry open prairies from 1,000 to 2,000 meters, generally in kind of dry open habitats. And usually does not grow in fine textured soils like clays. So unlike the side oat, it actually likes coarse soils. And here is an example of one of these stands of black grama. Finally, we have blue grama, Butella gracilis. In terms of its stats, it's a perennial native, and its inflorescence is also panicled, and again has 1 to 3 spicate, primarily unilateral branches. And so in this case, they're primarily unilateral, and so they may not always be unilateral. The branches are often curved and they spread at maturity, not extending beyond the spikelet bearing portion. The spikelets themselves, again, also have a rudimentary floret, which can be highly variable, which may have reduced awns. And then it also has a perfect floret, 1 per spikelet, and typically the lemma for these perfect florets are very pubescent on its back, and typically it has 3 awns. Vegetatively speaking, it's a cespitose plant with rhizomes and forms mats and can be sod forming. It typically has erect culms that are slender and are geniculate below, which again sharply curved, and glabrous, again smooth. And the blades are basal, which means it's growing out of that cespitose bunch. And here's a kind of close-up of Butella gracilis or blue grama and its inflorescence. And so you can kind of see some of its kind of spreading features as well as how hairy it is on different portions of the inflorescence. In terms of its growth characteristics, blue grama or Butella gracilis is a warm season plant that starts growth in May to June and flowers in June to October, and it reproduces primarily from tillers. It cannot tolerate shading from taller plants, so it's very sensitive to competition and invasive species. But it can withstand relatively heavy grazing, so it makes awesome forage. In terms of its forage value, like I said, good for all livestock classes as well as wildlife. But the quality is highest when it's green because it's more nutrition. But it retains a lot of that nutrition value when it's dry for forage production in the fall and the winter. In terms of its habitat, it typically occurs in open plains, mesas, foothills, and woodlands in all types of different soil textures. But typically it's more abundant in sandy or gravelly soils. And typically it's not found in wet or poor drained soils. And here is a nice view of a field of Butella gracilis along the road.